Lila sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes before she turned the key in the ignition, her hands still cold and shaky against the steering wheel. She didn't drive straight back to the apartment. Instead, she took the long route around Willow Creek, passing strip malls and quiet tree-lined streets, trying to untangle the tangled knot in her chest. A small part of her wanted to call Ethan right away, to demand answers before she even walked through their front door, but something held her back. If he'd hidden this reminder, he would lie smoothly, spin some harmless story that sounded reasonable enough to make her doubt herself. She needed more than a strange note and a humiliating morning to confront him. By the time she pulled into their shared driveway, the afternoon sun was dipping low, painting the siding of their small rental house in soft orange light. Ethan's work truck was already parked beside her sedan. He'd finished his service calls early. She took a deep breath, smoothed her jeans as best she could, and stepped out of the car. When she opened the front door, she smelled garlic and tomato sauce, his go-to weeknight pasta dinner. Ethan looked up from the stove, wooden spoon in one hand, and offered her his usual easy grin. He seemed completely at ease, no flicker of guilt crossing his face. "Hey, how was tutoring?" he asked, stirring the simmering sauce. "Sorry again about forgetting the pads this morning. Had an emergency furnace repair before 6, my brain was all over the place." Lila set her tote bag down by the entryway, her movements slow and deliberate. She kept her voice neutral, careful not to let anger or suspicion leak into her tone. "It was rough," she said simply. "I ended up bleeding through my jeans in front of the student." Pretty embarrassed. Ethan's smile faltered for half a second. Then he crossed the kitchen to pull her into a loose hug. His hand patted her back gently, the same comforting gesture he'd used 100 times before. "I'm so sorry, babe. That sounds terrible. We can stop at the grocery store later. Stock up on everything you need, okay?" She leaned into the hug for only a moment before stepping back, studying his. "I saw your note last night. The one in your phone, about someone's period, packing pads and pain." The change was little, but Lila caught it. Ethan's shoulders tensed, his gaze darting away for a split second before he met her eyes again. He kept his tone light, almost dismissive. "Oh, that was just a reminder for you. I must have written the date wrong, mixed up your cycle." "Bad." Her stomach twisted. That was exactly the excuse she feared. She didn't argue then. Pushing too hard would only make him shut down. Instead, she nodded slowly and checked, asking about his calls, letting the conversation drift to neutral topics while cooked. But every time he glanced away, every casual movement felt like. After they finished eating, Ethan headed to the shower, leaving his phone on the. Lila hesitated, then crossed the room and unlocked it with the passcode they'd agreed on. She pulled up the note first, but the reminder she'd seen the night before gone, deleted quickened. He hadn't just something. He'd erased. She moved to his text messages next, carefully, trying not to leave obvious traces. Most threads were with clients, his boss, old friends. Near the bottom of the list, a conversation with a contact named Mia Carter caught her eye. The messages were mostly short, casual work-related check-ins, nothing overtly romantic on the surface. But one text sent 2 days stood out. "Got those items about. Left them in the past." Lila's mind raced. What items? Pads? Painkillers? Before she could read further, the bathroom shut off. She quickly closed the app, locked the phone, and back to the couch, picking up a book and pretending to read as Ethan walked into the room. Towel on his shoulder. That night, Lila lay awake beside him long after he'd fallen asleep, his slow, steady breathing filling the quiet, dark room. She pulled up period tracker again, checking every entry, confirming once more that the date in his deleted note could to her. She thought about whether to call Clara, her right away. Part of her hated saying the words out loud, hated admitting the future she'd planned would be built on lies. If she told Clara, the secret would know. The next morning, Ethan left early again, claimed job. When the front door clicked shut, Lila grabbed her purse and drove to the store. She found the receipt printer by customer service, and after a few minutes of searching, she located a receipt from 2 days earlier's name. It listed a pack of maxi pads, bottle of ibuprofen, not for her. Use that brand. She folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into her wallet, a smooth proof. She sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot, in her hand. He wasn't just careless. He was hiding something from her. He had written a thought reminder for another woman, bought supplies for her, and then let Lila walk into her tutoring shift completely unprepared to fit emergency. Her fingers hovered over it in her phone. She hesitated for only a pressing call. The line rang twice before Clara picked up, her warm, familiar coming through the. "Hey, you sound off." Lila swallowed hard. staring out at the window. "I need to meet up. There's something you have to hear." The quiet in the air between them, and Lila knew nothing would go back to the easy trade shared before. The fragile surface of their engagement had cracked wide open, and there was no simple way to glue it back together. The kitchen overhead light hummed soft and warm over the chipped granite counter, the same counter Lila and Ethan had picked out together 8 months earlier, back when every decision felt like a quiet promise of the life they were building. She'd wandered over to grab her water bottle before bed, and Ethan's phone lay face up beside his coffee mug, still unlocked from when he'd stepped out onto the back porch to take a work call. She never snooped, not really. Trust had been the foundation of everything between them, or at least that was what she'd told herself for nearly 2 years. Her gaze drifted before she could look away, catching the line of text typed into his notes app. "Predict tomorrow is her period. Remember to prepare pads and painkillers in the bag." A faint, tender smile tugged at her lips at first. Her cycle tracked close to that window, and Ethan had been surprisingly thoughtful lately, noticing small things she barely mentioned aloud. She tucked the observation away as something sweet, a quiet proof he paid attention, then grabbed her bottle and headed to the bedroom, pushing the thought aside to sleep. She didn't take a screenshot, didn't dig further. Some part of her didn't want to ruin the gentle warmth the note gave her. The next morning arrived heavy and dull, the familiar low ache settling deep in Lila's lower abdomen before she even swung her legs over the bed. She groaned softly, reaching for the tote bag she used for tutoring, the same bag Ethan usually helped her pack if she was running late. She'd left it by the front door the night before, just like always. She dug one hand inside, fingers brushing against notebooks, pens, a half-empty pack of gum. No pads, no ibuprofen, nothing. Panic pricked at the base of her skull. She texted Ethan quickly, asking if he'd forgotten to tuck the supplies in like he'd planned. His reply came a few minutes later, short and casual. "Sorry, ran out the door early for a job. Pick some up on your way if you..." Lila's throat tightened. She didn't have time to... Her tutoring shift started in 15 minutes, and the high school sat on the far side of Willow Creek, with no convenience store along her direct. She climbed into her sedan, turning the heater on, hoping the cramping would ease, and that she'd make it through the 2-hour session without it. By the time she stepped into the windowless tutoring, the ache had sharpened into something relentless. A small group of freshman students sat around the long full table, working through English weeds, their voices light and distracted as they joked between. Lila pulled out her LAN, leaning one hand against the edge of the table to stay. And that was when she felt it. Hot, damp warmth spreading down the inside of her. Her face went pale in it. She froze mid-sentence, unable to focus on the paragraph one student was reading aloud. She shifted subtly in her chair, hoping no one noticed, but a quiet snicker cut. One boy's eyes darted toward the back of pants, then flicked over to his friend, whispering something too quiet for her. Another girl glanced down, then quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing with awkward embarrassment. Lila's ears burned. She mumbled an excuse about needing to step outside, grabbing her tote and practically fleeing the classroom, her shoes clicking too loud against the linoleum hallway. She locked herself in the tiny restroom, staring at the dark red stain blooming across the back of her dance, and the shame crashed over her. She'd spent years teaching these kids to heads up, to not let embarrassment, and now she could barely meet her own eyes. She used crumpled paper towels to press a stain, knowing it wouldn't thing, then waited until the hallway cleared before slipping. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine off, the parking lot quiet around her. At first, she told herself Ethan had simply overlooked the task, swamped by last-minute HVAC service calls and the stress of their upcoming. Everyone forgot things sometimes. That logic held up until she pulled up the period track on her phone, scrolling her cycle note. The reminder Ethan had typed the night before was for a different entirely, a window that belonged to someone else, not her. The sweet gesture she'd smiled at the night before wasn't. Her chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a heavy band around her ribs, squeezing Eddie. She pulled up Ethan's notes app in her mind, replaying the exact line again. No name attached, no context, just a quiet reminder woman. The life she mapped out. Wedding deposits, the shared lease, every quiet evening they'd spent planning the future together. She hid beneath her feet. What she'd written off as a simple oversight, innocent. Someone else occupied enough space in Ethan's days to track her cycle, to plan to pack feminine supplies for her. Lila stared out the windshield at the suburban sky, and for the first time since she did his proposal, she wondered exactly who the woman was. Clara suggested meeting at the small diner off Main Street, the same spot they'd gone to every few weeks for breakfast since Lila moved to Willow Creek. The booths were lined with worn vinyl, the coffee was always strong, and the steady hum of other patrons made it easy to talk without worrying about being overheard. Lila arrived 10 minutes early, the grocery receipt folded tight inside her wallet, her hands still restless as she stirred creamer into her mug over and over. When Clara slid into the seat across from her, she set her nurse's bag on the floor and studied Lila's face right away. "Okay, start from the beginning," Clara said, leaning forward. "Don't skip anything." Lila walked her through finding the memo. The public humiliation at the high school, Ethan's weak excuse about mixing up her cycle, and finally the deleted note and the receipt for feminine products she never used. She laid the paper across the table between them, and Clara picked it up, squinting at the printed items before setting it down again with a quiet sigh. "First rule, don't confront him yet," Clara said firmly. "If you blow up now, he'll lie harder, hide everything else, and you'll lose any chance to find out how deep this goes. You need to keep gathering what you can and set small boundaries so you don't keep letting him control the situation." Lila nodded, but her chest ached with uncertainty. The wedding venue deposit was already paid, along with half the catering. Thousands of dollars they couldn't easily get back. She'd spent weekends touring flower farms and sampling cake flavor, imagining every moment of the day she was supposed to marry Ethan. It felt like tearing pages out of a book she'd spent 2 years writing. That afternoon, Lila pulled up the wedding planner's number and sent a short message rescheduling their upcoming consultation. She didn't tell Ethan what she'd done. When he got home that evening and asked about their plans for the week, she told him she needed more time to think over some of the vendor choices. His expression shifted, confused at first, then faintly irritated. "We already pushed this back once," Ethan said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Everything has deadlines. If we wait too long, we could lose the florist." Lila answered calmly. "I just don't want to rush into decisions when I'm still overwhelmed from last week. Can we slow down a little?" He stared at her for a moment, then relented with a quiet puff, changing the subject. But Lila could feel the tension between them thickening. He was watching her more closely now, checking her phone screen when she sat down, asking more questions about where she went and who she spoke to. Over the next days, Lila dug gently through old saved messages while Ethan was out on jobs, careful not to leave obvious. She pulled up the thread with Mia Carter again, scrolling. Most exchanges were related, references to parts orders and shift coverage from when Ethan still worked at the hardware store. Buried near the bottom, though, was a text from Mia sent almost 10 months. "I still can't believe you're—" "I'll keep us." Lila's breath caught. Mia had known about the engagement for nearly a year. That meant whatever was happening had not started. That night, Lila brought up Mia's name while they sat on the couch, trying to gauge Ethan. "I saw Mia's name pop up in your old list today," Lila said, keeping her tone casual. "Do you talk to her much?" Ethan's thumb paused on the remote. "Occasionally, just work stuff. She left the hardware store a few months back." His was smooth, but Lila noticed he avoided meeting her eyes. He didn't push further. She had enough to know she needed to learn more about Mia before she... The next morning, Lila messaged Clara again, explaining what she'd found in the... Clara thought it over for a minute before responding. The hardware store where Mia worked now was on their own. Lila could go in under the pretense of buying supplies for a repair project and see spot Mia, maybe even arrange a quiet conversation. It felt risky, stepping directly into the middle of the secret Ethan was keeping, but she also knew she couldn't move forward without understanding the full truth. She typed out a short, careful message to Mia from a new burner account she up the night before, explaining she'd talk about Ethan, and asking if she'd be willing to meet at a park crowds. Hours later, Mia agreed to the afternoon. Lila locked her phone and stared at the screen, pounding. She had crossed a line now. She was no longer passively willing to slip up. She was actively choosing to cover the whole story, and there would be no easy way to step back when it happened. Whatever Mia told her would change everything in her and Ethan, and there would be no returning to the quiet, trusting life they had shared before she found his phone. The park where Lila agreed to meet Mia sat beside a small lake, ringed by oak trees that cast long, thin shadows across the grass. Lila arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a canvas tote with a paperback tucked inside to look casual, though she barely registered the words on the page. She kept her gaze fixed on the gravel path leading from the parking lot, watching for the woman whose name had occupied her thoughts for days. Mia showed up right on schedule, wearing a faded work flannel and sturdy boots, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She hesitated when she spotted Lila, then walked slowly toward the empty wooden bench and sat down a careful arm's length away. For a beat, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were a distant kid laughing by the water and leaves rustling in the light breeze. "You're Lila," Mia said finally, not quite a question. Her voice was quiet, edged with weariness. "I am," Lila replied. "I'm guessing you know why I wanted to talk." Mia nodded, picking at a loose splinter on the bench without looking over. She began to speak, painting herself as someone who had been misled. She explained that Ethan had told her the engagement was shaky, that he and Lila fought constantly, that the wedding might never actually happen. He'd reached out to her months ago, lonely and frustrated, and she'd believed him. Mia said she'd never intended to break up a serious relationship, that she'd only let herself care because Ethan kept insisting there was no real future between Lila and him. Lila listened carefully, her chest softening against her better judgment. Mia sounded genuine, hurt Ethan, like another person Ethan had tricked. For a moment, Lila found herself feeling sympathy for her, assuming Mia had no clear idea of everything Ethan was hiding. She asked a few gentle questions about the timeline of their contact, and Mia gave partial answers, leaving out key details. She avoided saying outright that she knew Ethan planned to go through with the... By the time Lila stood to leave, she thought she understood the situation differently than before. She texted Clara a quick summary of the conversation on the drive home, explaining that Mia seemed manipulated, not malicious. Clara called her almost immediately, her tone sharp with concern. "Don't rush to feel sorry for her," Clara warned. "People who are being strung along usually ask more questions. If she truly thought he might marry you, why keep seeing him?" Lila argued back, defending Mia, and the conversation grew tense before they... The small crack between Lila and Clara... For the first time since everything started, Lila felt alone in the... When Lila walked into the rental house that evening, Ethan was already... He'd ordered takeout from her favorite restaurant, the one she rarely let herself splurge on, and lit the vanilla candle she kept on the car. He greeted her with a soft smile, pulling her into a... "I know things have felt weird lately," Ethan said. "I hate that we've been tense. I want us to go..." He handed her the takeout container, and Lila hesitated before accepting it. The gesture was thoughtful, clapped Ethan, the kind of quiet kindness that had made her fall for him in the... She wanted to believe he was sorry, that he could fix whatever was broken. For a few hours, she set aside her doubts, eating dinner with him and talking about new topics, letting herself pretend the weight lifting off her chest. After Ethan's sleep, Lila grabbed her phone again, intending to send Clara a message smoothing over their fight. She decided to double-check the old text thread between Ethan and Mia, just to confirm the timeline vibed. Scrolling further back than before, she found a message from Mia sent her. "I know you're still wedding, but I'm willing to wait." Lila's ran cold. Mia had known the wedding was moving forward all along. She hadn't been misled. She had made a conscious choice to keep seeing Ethan even with full knowledge that Ethan intended. The version of events Mia had shared at the park, carefully edited, designed to make Lila see her as a victim. Lila had fallen the trap. She sank to the edge of the bed, staring at Ethan. Her earlier seemed foolish now. She'd misjudged completely, and that mistake had given the other woman room too. Clara to warn her. Lila glanced over at Ethan's sleeping room. He looked peaceful, unaware that Lila had uncovered the lie story. Her earlier hope that things could return to normal vanished entirely. The problem was bigger than a forgotten bag of supplies or a poorly written memo. Both Ethan and Mia had hidden bits of the truth from her, each protected. She pulled up Clara's contact again, her fingers shaking slightly as message. She had to apologize, to tell she'd made a mistake, and admit that she still had so much more to learn before either of them. Nothing was as simple as it had seemed that out on the park bench, and Lila realized she could not afford to trust anyone easing forward. Lila barely slept that night. She kept replaying Mia's carefully edited words in her head, comparing them against the old text she'd found, turning every half-truth over until dawn seeped through the bedroom curtains. When Ethan stirred awake beside her, she kept her face neutral, not letting him see how drastically her understanding had shifted. She made coffee quietly, went through the motions of their usual morning routine, and waited for him to grab his tool belt and head out for his first service call. The second the front door clicked shut, Lila spread her notebook across the dining table and began mapping out the timeline. She copied dates from Ethan and Mia's saved messages, marking when their exchanges turned personal, when Mia acknowledged the wedding plans, and when the memo about menstrual supplies had first appeared. The math settled heavy in her chest. Ethan and Mia had maintained their connection for nearly 10 months, overlapping almost the entire final year of Lila's engagement. What she'd first mistaken for a recent slip-up was a long-running secret. Next, she pulled up every invoice and contract related to the wedding. Venue deposit, catering retainer, florist booking, the non-refundable payment for the cake tasting. She tallied each line item on her calculator, and the final number made her pause. More than $6,000 sunk into reservations they could not easily recover. She and Ethan had saved together for those costs, setting aside small portions of each paycheck for over a year. Walking away meant swallowing that loss, giving up money they'd worked hard to earn. The fear of throwing all that away lingered, quiet and persistent. Her phone buzzed mid-calculation, the caller ID reading Ms. Hale. Lila hesitated before answering. Ethan's mother had always been warm toward her, eager for the wedding, quick to talk about grandchildren and family holidays. Lila answered softly, unsure what to expect. "Hi, honey," Ms. Hale said, her tone gentle but firm. "Ethan called me last. He says you've been distant, that you keep pushing back wedding planning. He's worried something's wrong between you." Lila's throat tightened. Ethan had gone to his mother before Lila had even fully confronted him. "We're working through a few things," Lila replied carefully. "Not ready to air every secret over the phone. Whatever fight you're having, don't let small disagreements ruin everything you've..." Ms. Hale continued. "Weddings bring us. Couples argue. Ethan's a good boy. He cares about you. Don't be too quick to hold one mistake against him." The conversation ended shortly, but the message... Ms. Hale intended to pressure Lila into forgiving Ethan, to preserve the wedding and the family reputation before Lila even laid out the full trail. Lila set her phone down and exhaled. She was not just navigating Ethan and me more. There were other people invested in keeping the engagement intact, people who would frame her as unreasonable if she chose to. She called Claire afterward, apologizing for their argument and sharing the full timeline she mapped out, along with the call for... Clara listened with accepting, then reminded Lila that money and outside pressure should not decide who she spent. "A bad marriage will cost you far more than $6,000, Clara. You can't stay just to protect the deposits or keep happy." Clara's words set over Lila, quiet. She spent the rest of the afternoon weighing every outcome. If she stayed to Ethan, she would live with the knowledge he had lived for months, that he had tracked another woman's needs while leaving her humiliated and students. If she ended the engagement, she faced financial loss, awkward questions from dual friends, and the grief of abandoning a future she'd imagined. Neither felt easy. By early evening, Lila made her decision. She would not the wedding, the costs, the pressure of mother, the fear over. None of those reasons were enough to commit herself to someone who had hidden a lie. She saved her screenshots, entry receipt, and her written timeline into a password-protected folder, organizing every piece of evidence. And when Ethan home that night, Lila sat him down at the dining table, the note in them. He stayed calm, no raised shouts, no death. "About Mia. I know this has gone on for almost 10 months. I've seen the texts, and I found the receipt for the pads and ibuprofen. I'm putting off the wedding." Ethan's face drained of color. For a long time, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the notebook spread open in front of him. The easy charm he usually leaned on completely. Lila watched him, knowing the hard part was still ahead. She had made her choice, but Ethan would not surrender the future of the fighting. The crisis was no longer about uncovering the truth. Now she had to hold firm to her decision, even as everyone around her could consider. Ethan stared across the table at Lila, his jaw tight, and for several long seconds the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He'd always been quick with a smile or a light joke to diffuse tension, but that easy mask slipped away completely. His shoulders slumped and he leaned forward, palms flat against the tabletop, voice rough and urgent. "Lila, please, don't say that. This isn't what you think." She kept her posture steady, not pulling back, but not softening either. She'd rehearsed this conversation in her head dozens of times through the sleepless nights, and she refused to let his panic shift her focus. "I've seen the texts. I have the receipt. I mapped the timeline. I know how long this went on. There isn't much left to misunderstand." Ethan's eyes darted away before he spoke again, scrambling to frame himself as someone caught off guard, rather than someone who'd chosen to lie repeatedly. He told her Mia had reached out first, that he'd been stressed with work and wedding planning, that Mia had manipulated his loneliness and kept pushing for more contact. He swore he'd never intended to leave Lila, that the whole thing had gotten out of hand before he knew how to stop it. "I kept telling her it couldn't go anywhere," he insisted. "I told her I was going to marry you. I never made any real promises." Lila paused, recalling the text she'd read months back in their old thread. The one where Mia wrote that she was willing to wait however long Ethan needed. That's not true, she said quietly. You made promises to her. You gave her reason to hope you'd choose her. You tracked her site, bought her supplies, and let me walk into a tutoring shift completely unprepared when I needed help. He flinched it, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he switched tack, begging for forgiveness, asking for just one chance to fix what he'd done. He talked about all the plans they'd made, the lease they shared, the money they'd put into vendors, the friends and family already expecting them. He listed every reason she might hesitate, laying out the cost of walking away like it was proof she couldn't afford to leave. Lila listened through it, her chest heavy with grief rather than anger. She grieved the version of Ethan she'd believed in, the quiet life they'd imagined building side by side. But grief was not enough to make her. Later that night, she called Clara to explain everything, to say she'd told Ethan the wedding. Clara supported her choice without hesitation, but she also warned Lila that she needed space to process on her own. I'm here whenever you, Clara said gently over the phone. But I don't want you leaning on me so hard that you never sit with this pain. Take a day or two to breathe before we make any next. After the call ended, Lila paced the small living room while Ethan sat silently on the couch, staring at. She thought about the shame from that morning in the tutoring wing, the way the students' whispers had burned into her, and how that humiliation had only been a small piece of a much larger betrayal. She'd spent years avoiding conflict, trying to keep everyone comfortable, afraid of looking weak or creative. That habit had let Ethan hide his secret. Around midnight, Ethan stood and crossed the room toward her. He reached her, but she stepped back before his crumpled. What do you need to do? He asked his king. Tell me how to. And away. Answered. Not anymore. This morning, before he woke, Lila retrieved her engagement ring from the jewelry dish on the bathroom counter. The thin band caught the gray early light filtering through the window. She set it on his pillow with a short note that said only the wedding was canceled. She packed a duffel bag with clothes, toiletries, laptop, careful to grab the external drive holding copies. When Ethan woke and found the ring in the empty of the bed, he called. She sent one text explaining she was staying with Clara temporarily and asked him not to show up at Clara's town. She pulled into Clara's driveway just as. The guest room was small, with a narrow dresser, but it felt like the first safe space. Lila closed the door behind her, the mattress, and finally cried. She had lost the planned, her home for the time being, and the person she'd thought she would end her life with. Ethan's pleas for reconciliation in her head, tempting her to death. But even in that lowest moment, Lila understood she could not go back. She had lost nearly every outside support she'd gone for comfort, yet somewhere inside her, her resolve settled into something solid and unshakable. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The guest room at Clara's townhouse stayed dim most of the morning, thick curtains blocking the bright midday sun. Lila slept fitfully for a few hours, then dragged herself out of bed, her eyes puffy and her limbs heavy. She brewed a cup of weak coffee in Clara's kitchen and sat at the breakfast bar, scrolling through dozens of missed texts and calls from Ethan. Most messages begged her to talk, to meet, to reconsider. A few grew sharp, accusing her of overreacting and throwing away 2 years of their lives over a mistake. She did not reply to any of them. Clara had left for her nursing shift early, leaving a handwritten note on the fridge with the address and hours for the free legal aid clinic in downtown Willow Creek. Lila had looked it up the night before, curious whether any of their wedding deposits could be recovered. She showered, pulled on plain jeans and a long-sleeve shirt, and drove across town to the small brick community building. The waiting room was quiet, lined with folding chairs and stacks of informational pamphlets. After signing in, she sat for nearly an hour before meeting with a volunteer legal advocate. Lila laid out the situation plainly. Shared savings used for non-refundable wedding deposit, no prenuptial agreement, a broken engagement due to infidelity. The advocate explained that most vendor contracts had strict cancellation clauses, but a few might negotiate partial refunds if she reached out calmly before final payments were due. The advocate also warned her to avoid angry, accusatory messages to Ethan or me, since hostile communications could be used against her if any disputes over shared property arose later. Stick to facts only, the advocate advised. No name-calling, no emotional outbursts. Keep everything documented and safe. Lila left the clinic with printed guides and a clearer plan. On the drive back, she thought about the evidence stored safely in her cloud drive and external hard drive. She had enough proof to know the truth, but lashing out would only weaken her position. Revenge wasn't the accountability and a clean separation. Once back at Clara's house, Lila sat at the dining table and drafted a message. She deleted 3 angry versions before settling on a calm, factual. She listed the timeline of Ethan's affair, the memo she'd, the feminine product, and the text proving Mia knew about the wedding all along. She did not insult Mia. She simply stated that Ethan had lied to both, and that she wanted to understand the full extent of what had happened before finalizing everything with. She sent the message from the burner account and set her phone, trying not to stare at the screen waiting for a. Ethan kept messaging throughout the app. He alternated between apologetic pleas and thinly veiled frustration, asking when she planned to come home, demanding they discuss splitting their furniture and rent obligations for the remaining lease term. Lila responded once, short, "We can arrange a neutral public meeting to separate shared belongings once everything." No in-person visits to. Late that evening, her burner phone. Mia had back. She said she also realized Ethan had manipulated her, that she wanted to share a few final messages Ethan sent her, and agreed to meet alone at the lakeside park the next afternoon, without knowing. Lila stared at the reply for. This was the shift she had been. For weeks, Ethan had controlled the narrative, hiding evidence and shaping what both women knew. Now Mia was willing to give her the last piece of proof, and Ethan no longer held. Lila saved Mia's reply to her secure folder and texted Claire. She could feel a quiet tension lift her shoulders. She was no longer scrambling to uncover secrets. She was gathering everything she needed to walk completely, with clear boundaries, and she poured herself a glass of water and looked out the kitchen window at the quiet. The hardest days of shock and grief were not entirely behind her, but she was no longer stuck at rock bottom. She had a plan, safe housing, legal guidance, and soon, the final truth. The balance of power had begun to turn away from Ethan, and the final reckoning. The lake park felt different this second time around. The air carried a faint, crisp edge, the first quiet sign that summer was starting to fade. Lila arrived with her phone fully charged and set to auto-save every photo and text, following Clara's advice to document every part of the conversation. She found Mia already waiting at the same wooden bench, a crumpled paper envelope resting beside her on the slatted wood. Mia didn't waste time with small talk. She slid the envelope across the bench. Inside were screenshots printed out, long text exchanges Ethan had sent her over the past several months. He'd repeatedly promised that once the wedding was called off, he would move in with Mia, that Lila was just a habit he couldn't break easily. One message stood out. "I'll handle Lila. She'll forgive me, and then we can figure out our life together." Lila scanned each printed page slowly, her jaw tightening. Ethan had been weaving separate lies for both women, feeding each of them hope for a future that was never real. "He kept saying you were stubborn, that you'd cave if he apologized enough," Mia said quietly. "I finally realized he was never going to choose me either. He only wanted to keep both of us available." Lila folded the screenshots neatly and slipped them into her tote bag. She thanked Mia for meeting her, but made no offer of friendship. They were both hurt by the same man, but that did not erase Mia's choice to continue the affair knowing the wedding was planned. They parted ways without exchanging further contact. On the drive back to Clara's, Lila uploaded every new screenshot to her encrypted cloud storage. Her full set of evidence was now complete. There was no missing piece left to hunt for. What she did not expect was how quickly Ethan tried to rewrite the story among their mutual friends. That evening, a text arrived from an old college acquaintance, hesitant and "I heard things are rough between you and Ethan. He said you've been distant and unreasonable, that you're calling off the wedding over a silly misunderstanding." More messages trickled in over the next few hours. Ethan was quietly telling their shared circle that Lila was overreacting, that a small argument had spiraled out of control, painting himself as the wounded, patient partner. If that version spread widely, Lila risked being labeled dramatic or unstable in their tight-knit Willow Creek social. Clara urged her not to fire off angry replies to everyone. Instead, they drafted a neutral, factual summary. It included no emotional language, no name-calling. It simply stated that Ethan had maintained a long-term affair with Mia Carter throughout their engagement, attached only key redacted proof for context, and confirmed the wedding was permanently. Lila sent the message to every close mutual friend who had reached out asking for her. She did not forward it idly or post anything publicly. She only wanted to stop Ethan's one-sided narrative before it. The effect was. Many friends texted back saying they had suspected Ethan was hiding something. A few chose to remain neutral, unwilling to pick sides. The social circle began splitting apart. Mia also cut off all contact with Ethan shortly after their park meeting, blocking his number and every social media account he used. Ethan lost his ability to manipulate either woman behind. That night, Lila sat on Clara's back porch under the dark sky, sipping. The power had shifted. Ethan no longer controlled you. He could no longer lie separately. All the secret laid out, and there was no way for him to spin the situation back. The final face-to-face conversation was Ethan would want to discuss returning the engagement ring, dividing furniture, and settling the remainder of their lease. Lila texted him to propose a meeting at the quiet diner on the street, with Clara accompanying her. Ethan replied. Lila locked her phone and stared up at the faint stars. She had spent weeks digging through lies, gathering evidence and boundaries. Soon, she would have the final conversation that closed this chapter of her life for good. The diner off Main Street smelled like fried potatoes and freshly brewed coffee when Lila and Clara walked in. They picked the booth farthest from the entrance, with a clear view of the front door, just as they'd agreed. Clara set her purse on the floor beside her seat and gave Lila's arm a quiet, reassuring squeeze before sitting back, ready to stay present without interrupting unless Lila signaled for help. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later. He wore a clean flannel shirt, his hair neatly combed, and carried a folded list of shared household items scribbled on notebook paper. When he spotted Clara, his jaw tightened, but he slid into the booth across from Lila without arguing. For the first few minutes, they stuck to practical details: the couch, the dining set, the small refrigerator they'd bought together. They talked through who would take what, how to coordinate moving day, and how to split the final month of rent on the rental house. Ethan kept his tone controlled, almost formal, as if he hoped they could wrap everything up as a simple logistics problem and skip the harder conversation hanging between them. Once the list was mostly settled, Ethan leaned forward, his voice softening into the familiar pleading tone Lila knew well. "Can we at least talk about us? I know I messed up, but I've spent every day thinking about how to fix this. I never meant to hurt you this bad." Lila met his gaze steadily. "There's nothing left to fix. I'm only here to finalize our separation." Ethan's composure cracked. He shifted between apologizing and shifting blame, saying Mia had pursued, that the stress of work and wedding planning had clouded his judgment, that he'd never intended for everything to fall apart. He tried to frame his choices as a series of small mistakes rather than a deliberate, months-long pattern of lying. Clara opened her mouth once to speak, but Lila shook her head slightly. She wanted Ethan to hear this directly. "You tracked another woman's skull. You bought pads and painkillers for her. Then you left me with nothing the day I needed those same supplies, when I was standing in front of a room full of students. You let me go through that humiliation while you were planning for someone else." Ethan's eyes dropped to the table. For a long beat, he said. The clink of silverware and distant chatter from other booths filled the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and "I wrote that memo. I didn't pack anything for you that morning because I was scared if I moved supplies around in your bag, you'd find them and ask questions right away. I thought I could keep both lives separate long enough to figure out what." The plain admission hung heavy in the air. There was no more room for half-truths, no more excuses. Ethan confirmed every piece of the story Lila had pieced together over weeks. He had chosen secrecy over honesty, chosen avoiding conflict over treating either woman. "I don't want any more," Lila told him. "I don't want late-night apologies or promises to change. I only want everything divided cleanly, and no unnecessary contact after." Ethan tried one last time to suggest they go down, to consider counseling, to revisit the possibility of reconciliation after some time passed. Lila shook her firmly. "Our engagement is over. This conversation closes it." They finished reviewing the list of belongings, wrote down agreed pickup times, and confirmed they would communicate only through text about logistics moving forward. Ethan pushed himself out of the slowly, pausing for a second like he might say something else, then turned and walked toward the door with "Gone." Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized. Clara reached across the table and rested her hand lightly on it. Lila nodded, staring at the empty doorway. The central betrayal had been ignored. The long chase for answers, the late nights scrolling through messages, the careful meetings and evidence collection, all led to this quiet diner conversation. The biggest conflict was resolved. Only the practical loose ends remained to be tied up before she could fully step into Ethan. Moving day arrived on a gray Saturday morning. Lila met Ethan at the rental house with Clara beside her, and they worked through the agreed list without raised voices. Furniture was carried out to separate trucks, boxes labeled clearly, shared kitchen items split evenly. Ethan did not try to linger for extra conversation. He handed over a spare house key, and that was the last time Lila saw him in person. In the weeks that followed, Lila contacted each wedding vendor one by one. Most contracts held firm to their non-refundable policies, but the catering company agreed to return a small portion of the retainer since they had not yet ordered specialty ingredients. The partial refund helped soften the blow, though thousands of dollars remained lost. Lila accepted it as the cost of choosing self-respect over a dishonest marriage. She slowly unpacked her things into a small one-bedroom apartment she found on the other side of Willow Creek, closer to the community college where she took classes. The space was modest, but it belonged only to her. She hung new art on the walls, set up a desk for tutoring lesson plans, and built a routine that did not revolve around planning a wedding or waiting for Ethan to come home from work. She still thought occasionally about that humiliating morning in the high school tutoring wing. The shame faded with time, replaced by a quiet resolve. That public embarrassment had pushed her to look deeper, to question what she had accepted as love, and to walk away before signing a lifetime commitment. She stopped tutoring at that high school after the semester ended, switching to private in-home sessions with students instead. It was a small change, but it helped her leave that painful memory behind. Months later, Lila heard from a mutual acquaintance that Ethan and Mia's connection had fallen apart shortly after the diner meeting. Without secrets to hide or separate versions of the truth to maintain, the fragile bond they'd shared crumbled quickly. Mia moved out of Willow Creek entirely, and Ethan threw himself into overtime service calls, keeping to himself around town. Lila felt no satisfaction at the news, only a quiet sense that everyone involved had borne the consequences of their choice. One mild autumn afternoon, Lila sat on her apartment balcony with a notebook, drafting a new 5-year plan. She wrote down degree milestones, certification goals for teen, travel ideas she'd set aside during the engagement, savings targets for a future. No lines mentioned a partner or a wedding. Every goal centered solely on what she wanted to build for. Clara stopped by that evening with takeout and 2 mugs. They sat together on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the rooftops warm. "You're different," Clara said. Lila smiled, twisting the simple silver band she'd bought for herself a few weeks prior, a replacement for the engagement ring she'd left. "I'm finally just..." She thought back to the night she first saw Ethan. The brief, sweet smile she'd given it before everything unraveled. That version of her had been eager to fit her life into someone else's future. Now she understood that trust could not survive deliberate lies, and that she did not need a fiancé's thoughtfulness to feel worthy of care. She could provide that. There would still be hard days, moments of loss, old memories that surfaced unexpectedly. But the long, exhausting search for truth was finished. The betrayal had been named, boundaries set, loose ends tied. Lila closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair, breathing in the cool. This chapter was closed, and whatever came next was hers alone to write.